In ponds, there are two types of algae. There's what we affectionately call the good type of algae, and then there's string algae. The good type of algae is, that's the algae that grows on the walls of the pond, and it's very thin, it's never more than a quarter inch thick. And it's beneficial because as the fish produce this waste and your filter turns the ammonia to nitrites and nitrites to nitrates, the algae will consume the nitrates to grow and gives off oxygen. So we like having that algae in our pond. It makes it healthier. The problem is that as the water warms up, this algae is very prone to giving off what we call algae blooms. And they'll release just billions of little 3-micron cells as it reproduces into the water. And it can turn your water just pea green. You can't see 2 inches into the water. Even the best filter will not filter out 3-micron items. So the most effective way to get rid of this algae is an ultraviolet light. The way the light works is that as the water from the pond flows through this, it's usually a tube with a quartz sleeve and then this ultraviolet light. It radiates out enough power so that as the algae goes through it, it breaks up the DNA in the algae. And then as the algae dies, after 3 or 4 days, it starts to clot together. And then when you get 10 or 12 algae cells caught together and it gets up to a big enough size, the filter will filter it out and you get green water. So having an ultraviolet light in your pond, it just takes the hassle out of these algae blooms. You'll never even know it. As the algae starts to bloom, the UV light will kill it back without you ever seeing anything. And they're an important part of keeping a crystal clear pond. Now the downside is the string algae, that's a different animal. That grows on the sides of your pond. It doesn't know you have a UV light in your pond. So if you have string algae, the UV light's not going to help that. That is typically corrected with a chemical, an algae killer. A couple things to consider with the UV light and in selecting one is that, for instance, units with multiple lamps coupled together can be very effective, but once a year you have to change out these lamps. A single lamp unit, the larger one, is oftentimes less expensive yearly, on a yearly basis, replacing the lamps than multiple units. So you may want to consider buying a unit with just a single lamp, a bigger lamp. Additionally, buying a UV light that's too small for your pond will have almost no effect on the algae. It just will never catch up with an algae bloom and you won't see the clear water. So make sure that when you get a UV light for your pond that you either get the proper size or ideally oversize it. Now even if you get the proper size, for instance, for a 2,000 gallon pond, you might recommend a 40-watt lamp. A 40-watt lamp typically requires approximately 25 gallons a minute going through it. If you're running 40 or 50 gallons a minute through your pond, you may want to put a bypass, or at least consider putting a bypass on the UV light, because if you're running it through 50 gallons a minute, it's going through so fast that the UV light is not going to be efficient. But on the other hand, if you put a bypass where you send, for instance, half the water through that and half directly into the pond, again, it'll make that 40-watt efficient enough to cover your 2,000 gallon pond. But now on the other hand, when you get into larger ponds, like if you put Emperor Aquatic makes a 150 HO, that's recommended for flows anywhere from 83 to well over 100 gallons a minute. In most ponds, with that application, you can just run the water all through it. From time to time, you'll find a pond that's matured to the point to where it doesn't need a UV light. That can happen from sometimes, but it can also take years or may never happen at all. So for that reason, every time we build a pond, we put a UV light on it. I wouldn't build a pond without installing one.